The summer heat clung to the pine-thick hills of Clay County, Alabama like a fever that refused to break. In a sagging clapboard house set back from a red dirt road, where the mailbox had long ago lost its numbers and the porch swing hung by a single rusted chain, Harlan Ray Gentry ruled over 3 generations of women who shared his blood and his bed. Whispers had drifted through the county for decades, carried on the same humid air that smelled of kudzu and moonshine stills, but no sheriff ever knocked on that warped front door. Folks said the Gentry place was cursed, that the devil himself had struck a bargain with old Harlan the day he came back from Korea with one eye milky and the other burning like a coal. They said the cries that sometimes floated from the upstairs windows after midnight weren't from hogs being slaughtered. Inside those walls, time moved differently. Calendars yellowed and curled. Babies were born with the same narrow face and pale hair, their birth certificates listing fathers who didn't exist. Harlan kept them all, his ancient mother who'd never been right since giving birth to him at 14, his sister who'd come home from Birmingham with a suitcase and nowhere else to go, his daughter who'd grown into the spitting image of both women under one roof, under one rule. His rule. And when the youngest girl, barely flowered into womanhood, began to show the same unmistakable swell beneath her faded sundress that her mother and grandmother had worn before her, the cycle tightened its final, suffocating turn. The screen door creaked open at dusk now, and something watches from the tree line with eyes too human to belong to any deer. The Greyhound bus coughed to a stop on the cracked shoulder of Highway 9 just as the sun bled out across the loblolly pines, painting everything the color of old bruises. Harlan Ray Gentry stepped down with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a discharge paper folded so many times it felt like cloth in his pocket. 24 years old, one eye clouded white from a mortar flash outside Chosin, the other the pale, washed-out blue of creek ice. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words since San Diego. The driver didn't ask for them. He walked the last 3 miles barefoot because the army boots had rubbed his heels raw on the long ride south. The red dust rose between his toes and coated the cuffs of his uniform until he looked like something dragged up from the clay itself. Folks sitting on porches watched him pass without waving. They knew the Gentry walk, that slow, deliberate sway, like a man listening to music nobody else could hear. The house hadn't changed. Same peeling clapboard the color of nicotine, same tin roof patched with license plates and prayer. The swing still hung crooked, chain rusted through on one side so it tilted like a hanged man. When he pushed open the gate it screamed on hinges that hadn't known oil since Roosevelt, Truman, didn't matter which one. His mother was on the porch shelling butter beans into a dented pan, moving slow the way very young mothers do when the child they birthed has already outgrown them. She was 38 but looked 50, hair the texture of broom straw, belly still soft from the last baby that hadn't lived. She didn't stand when she saw him, just let the beans slide from her lap and scatter across the boards like pale hail. Harlan dropped the duffel, took the 3 steps in one motion, and pressed his face into the crook of her neck the way he had when he was small and the world still made sense. She smelled of wood smoke and lye soap and something sweeter, something that made the thing behind his good eye uncoil and stretch. That night he bathed in the tin washtub on the back porch while fireflies stitched green seams through the dark. She poured water over his head from the bucket she'd warmed on the stove, fingers working the lye across his scalp like she was washing away the war itself. When he stood, water streaming off the new scars and the old hunger, she didn't look away. The moon lit them both bone-white and unforgiving, and the pines held their breath. Later, in the narrow iron bed that had been his father's before the man drank himself into the clay, Harlan pulled her down beside him. She went willingly, the way a woman walks into a familiar storm because the alternative is standing alone in the open. The house settled around them, boards popping like knuckles, and somewhere in the walls the first link of the chain clicked quietly into place. The Birmingham city bus dropped Dolores Gentry at the same dusty shoulder where her brother had stepped off 3 years earlier. October 1961, air thick with wood smoke and the sour smell of fear. She carried one cardboard suitcase tied with baling twine and a face so bruised the left side had swollen her eye shut. The right eye, the same pale ice blue as Harlan's good one, darted like a trapped bird. She walked the red road in low-heeled pumps that raised blisters within a mile. Every step sent pain shooting up her legs, but pain was familiar now, it was the silence she couldn't stand. In Birmingham the neighbors had banged on the walls when her husband used his fists. Out here only, the crows answered. The house looked smaller than memory, sagging deeper into the kudzu like it was trying to crawl away. Harlan sat on the top step whittling a pine stick into nothing, knife moving slow and certain. He didn't rise when he saw her, just tilted his head the way a hound does when it catches a scent it already knows. The milky eye fixed somewhere past her shoulder, the good one pinned her in place. Their mother hovered in the doorway, apron twisted in her hands, mouth working soundlessly. Dolores dropped the suitcase. It split open at the seams and spilled out everything she owned: 2 house dresses, a cracked bottle of Evening in Paris, a blood-stained dish towel she'd used to stanch her split lip the night she finally ran. Harlan's gaze moved over the contents the way a man studies a menu he already intends to order from. He stood then, all 6'3" of him unfolded like a blade, and crossed the yard in 3 strides. The knife went into his pocket. One hand closed around her upper arm hard enough to leave prints, the other brushed a knuckle across the purple bloom on her cheek with something that might have been tenderness if tenderness ever wore that expression. Inside, the house smelled of fried fatback and camphor. Their mother tried to fuss, heating water, offering the last of the hoe cakes, but Harlan waved her silent. He steered Dolores down the narrow hall to the room that had been hers before marriage, before Birmingham, before the man who put out cigarettes on her thighs. The iron bedstead waited exactly as she'd left it, quilt faded to the color of weak tea. Night came quick in the pines. When the lamp was out and the house creaked itself to sleep, the door opened without a knock. Moonlight carved a silver path across the floorboards and Harlan followed it straight to her. She smelled the sweat and pine tar on his skin, felt the mattress sink under his weight. Somewhere down the hall their mother turned over in her own bed and pulled the pillow over her ears. Dolores didn't cry out. She had already learned in the city that noise only made it last longer. Instead she opened like a gate left unlatched in a storm, and Harlan walked through carrying the same silence he'd brought home from Korea, only now it had teeth. March 1965 came in wet and mean, the creek behind the house running red with clay and the dogwoods blooming blood pink against the gloom. Dolores had grown huge, her belly leading her through rooms like a lantern she couldn't set down. She moved slow, one hand always pressed to the small of her back, the other braced against walls that seemed to lean inward whenever she passed. Their mother followed at a distance, wringing a dish towel into ropes, murmuring half-remembered prayers she'd learned from tent revivals long gone. Harlan watched from doorways, silent as smoke. He'd taken to oiling the hinges so nothing announced him anymore. Some evenings he sat on the porch steps carving whistles he never gave away, the knife-flicking curls of cedar that smelled like church pews and funeral parlors both. When Dolores waddled past he'd reach out and lay a palm flat against the drum-tight skin of her stomach, feeling the kicks like accusations, and smile with the half of his mouth that still worked right. The pain started just after midnight on a Thursday, rain ticking on the tin roof like impatient fingers. Their mother boiled water though there was no doctor coming, no midwife, only the 3 of them and whatever waited in the dark beyond the lamp's reach. Dolores screamed once, a sound torn out of her like barbed wire, then bit down on a rolled-up feed sack until her teeth met through the burlap. Harlan stood at the foot of the iron bed, sleeves rolled high, forearms corded and shining with sweat though the room was cold. He didn't speak, didn't coax, he simply waited the way a man waits for a deer to step into the clearing he already owns. The baby slid out slick and squalling just before dawn, a girl with a shock of pale hair the color of weak sunlight and eyes the pale Gentry blue even through the birth film. Their mother cut the cord with Harlan's whittling knife, hands trembling so badly she nicked her own thumb. Blood dotted the sheets like scattered berries. Dolores turned her face to the wall and slept the sleep of the emptied things. Harlan lifted the child first. He held her up to the window where the first grey light crawled in, studying the tiny fists, the perfect curl of ears that matched his own. Then he carried her down the hall to the room that had been his when he was small, laid her in the same cradle their father had built before disappearing into a bottle. He stood over her a long time, thumb brushing the downy skull, while the rain softened to a whisper and the pines dripped like they were crying for somebody else. When he returned to the birthing room he told their mother the child's name would be Cora, same as the sister who died of fever when they were children, the one whose grave had no stone. Dolores didn't argue, she was already drifting miles away inside herself. Harlan pulled the quilt up to her chin, kissed the damp hair at her temple once, gentle as a man closing a music box, then went to fry fatback for breakfast while the new baby cried herself hoarse in the next room and the house folded another secret into its bones. The summer Cora turned 10, the air turned thick enough to chew, heat lightning flickering every night like God taking flash photographs of what went on inside the clapboard house. She had grown tall and thin, all knees and elbows, hair so pale it looked white when the sun hit it, eyes the washed-out blue that never quite met yours straight on. Folks at the little country store called her pretty in the way people speak of colts right before they break them. Harlan started small, the way you gentle a wild thing. A hand left too long on the nape of her neck when he showed her how to sight down a .22 barrel. Letting her sit on his lap on the porch swing long after most fathers would have shooed a child away. Reading to her from the big family Bible at night, voice low and steady, finger tracing the verses while his other hand rested on the soft skin just above her knee, inching higher with every chapter until the good book itself felt complicit. He told her she was special. Told her the world outside was full of men who would hurt her the way her Uncle Ray hurt Mama Dolores before she came home. Told her blood stayed with blood, that the Gentrys had always kept their own counsel and their own women. He said it soft, the way preachers talk about salvation, and Cora drank it down because love, even twisted, tastes sweet when you're starving. By 12 she knew the shape of his wanting the way other girls knew multiplication tables. By 13 she stopped wearing nightgowns to bed because he liked the feel of bare skin under the sheet. Some nights he only held her, breath hot against her ear, whispering promises about the day she'd be old enough to understand how deep a father's love could go. Other nights his hands mapped places no father's hands should ever travel, patient and thorough, teaching her body lessons her mind still tried to refuse. The afternoon she turned 14 the sky hung low and yellow, the kind of light that makes dogs howl for no reason. Harlan sent the women to town with a list long enough to keep them gone till dark. He led Cora to the barn where the air smelled of sweet feed and old leather, laid her down on a blanket still carrying the scent of horses and hay. He told her this was her real birthday present, the one only he could give. When she cried he kissed the tears away and called her his good girl, his only girl, his forever. Afterward he carried her back to the house like a bride, bathed her in the tin tub the way their grandmother once bathed him, washing away blood and innocence both. That night he moved her things into the big bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the heavy oak door that locked from the inside. Cora lay in the dark listening to the house breathe around her and understood, with the sudden clarity of a bone snapping, that the chain had grown another link and this time it circled her own throat. June 1978 arrived with a heat so brutal the tar bubbled in the cracks of Highway 9 and the creek shrank to a string of warm, muddy puddles. Cora was 15, belly round and hard as a feed bucket under the faded sundress that had once been Dolores's. She moved through the house like a ghost someone had forgotten to bury, hands always cradling the weight that grew heavier every day, eyes fixed on corners where shadows pooled thickest. Harlan had taken to humming while he worked in the yard, old Baptist hymns turned inside out, the notes coming slow and satisfied. He built a cradle from scrap pine, sanding it smooth with his own palms until the wood glowed pale gold, the same color as Cora's hair. Some evenings he pressed his ear to her stomach and grinned at the kicks, telling the unborn child stories about the land it would inherit, the blood it already carried, the rules it would learn before it ever learned to walk. Dolores watched from the kitchen window, dishwater cooling around wrists gone thin and sharp as fence wire. She had not spoken more than a dozen words since the morning Cora's bleeding stopped and Harlan announced the news by carving another notch in the bedpost. Now she moved through chores like a woman underwater, eyes flat, mouth set in a line that might have been grief or might have been relief that the worst had finally happened to someone else. Their grandmother, 57 now, hair white as salt, spine bent from decades of bending, sat in the rocker on the porch shelling peas into the same dented pan she'd used the day Harlan came home from Korea. She hummed along with him sometimes, cracked voice threading through his deeper two parts of the same cursed song. When Cora shuffled past, belly leading, the old woman reached out gnarled fingers and brushed the taut skin with something that looked like reverence. Labor came at twilight on a Friday, sky the color of a fresh bruise. No one went for help. Help had never come to this house and never would. Cora screamed until her throat shredded, nails digging half-moons into Harlan's forearms while he knelt between her knees the way he had knelt in rice paddies long ago, steady, patient, waiting for life to rip its way out of her. Dolores held one hand, grandmother the other, both women's faces slick with tears they would never explain. The baby arrived just after midnight, another girl, small but fierce, lungs already full of rage. Harlan cut the cord himself, tied it off with baling twine, then lifted the child high so the coal oil lamp painted her wet skin bronze. He named her Lily on the spot, said the name tasted clean in his mouth, like spring water. Cora turned her face into the pillow and slept the sleep of the drowned while the newborn's cries braided with the cicadas outside and the house swallowed another generation whole. The winter of 1985 was cruel even by Clay County standards. Ice glazed the pines until they cracked like rifle shots in the night, and the pump in the yard had to be thawed with boiling water every dawn. Harlan was 51 now, hair gone the color of iron filings, shoulders still wide but beginning to carry the weight of decades the way a porch carries snow. The milky eye had spread its cloud until only a sliver of blue remained. The good eye or not, he saw everything. Grandmother Gentry, 68, spine twisted like a river birch, hands knotted with arthritis, had shrunk to the size of a child. She spent her days in the rocker by the wood stove, wrapped in quilts that smelled of camphor and old blood, humming fragments of lullabies no one else remembered. Her mind wandered farther each season, calling Cora Dolores and Dolores Mama and Harlan my sweet boy in the same breath. Doctors were for people who believed in rescue. She had not left the property since the Eisenhower years. It began on a night when the wind found every crack in the house and moaned through them like a dying woman. Harlan carried her from the rocker to the big bed that had once been his parents', quilt and all, because the cold had settled in her bones and would not leave. He warmed her the only way he still knew how, slow and deliberate, the way a man banks a fire he intends to keep burning for years. She murmured against his neck, half asleep, half remembering the first time when she was 14 and terrified and he was only hours old. The circle closed so completely neither of them bothered to pretend it was anything else. Spring came late and mean. By April her belly rose beneath the quilts, small but undeniable, a hard knot under skin gone thin as onion paper. Cora and Dolores moved around her like satellites around a dying star, bringing broth she could not keep down, changing sheets that smelled of sickness and something older. Harlan sat beside her every evening, reading from the same Bible in the same low rumble, one hand resting possessively on the swell that should never have been. She lasted until late August, heat so thick the air felt like wet wool. When the pains started she did not scream, she had no strength left for it. Only whimpered, soft and lost, while Harlan knelt again at the foot of the bed and the women held her hands that had once held him as a newborn. The baby came too early, a boy, blue and silent, cord wrapped twice around his neck like a promise kept too well. She followed an hour later, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though she finally saw a door the rest of them could not. Harlan wrapped them both in the same quilt and carried them out to the family plot behind the barn where kudzu had already claimed half the stones. He dug one grave deep enough for two, laid them in the tiny bundle first, then his mother on top like a blessing or a curse, and covered them with the red clay that had always claimed its own. When he came back to the house at dusk his shadow stretched across the yard longer than any living man's should, and the women waiting on the porch knew the chain had snapped its weakest link but somehow grown stronger for it. August 1989 burned itself into the clay like a brand. The funeral had been 3 days of black dresses and lemonade gone sour in the heat, neighbors coming just close enough to the porch to drop off a ham or a pie before retreating to their pickups, unwilling to cross the invisible line the Gentry land drew around itself. Harlan stood at the grave until the dirt settled, then drove the shovel through the mound so hard the handle cracked. That night he drank a jar of corn liquor on the back steps and spoke to the dark the way other men speak to God. The women moved through the house like breath held too long. Dolores, 46 now, grey threading her braid like frost, kept finding herself in the dead woman's rocker and jerking upright as if burned. Cora, 24, and already looking 40, scrubbed floors that would never come clean. Lily, 11 going on 30, watched everything with those pale, unblinking eyes and asked no questions because she already knew the answers would taste like rust. Harlan's certainty cracked the morning he woke to find blood on his own thighs, bright, shocking, impossible. He sat on the edge of the bed staring at it the way he once stared at the milky ruin of his eye in a mirror outside Seoul, understanding for the first time that some wounds open inward and never close. He burned the sheet in the barrel behind the barn and stood over the flames until his face blistered, but the smell of scorched cotton followed him for weeks. He began seeing his mother in every corner, her silhouette in the barn loft, her humming rising from the well at noon when no one else was outside. Once he found the rocker moving though the room was empty, slow creak like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He smashed it with an axe and fed the splinters to the stove, but the next morning the chair sat whole again by the window, quilt folded neat across the arm. The preacher from the new church in Lineville drove out twice, left tracts on the porch that blew away unread. Harlan met him at the gate the third time with the .12 gauge across his arm and said if the man wanted to save souls he could start with his own. After that the county learned to look past the Gentry place the way you look past a grave you're afraid might look back. At night Harlan paced the hall in his bare feet, stopping at each bedroom door to listen, Dolores breathing shallow through her mouth, Cora curled tight as a fist, Lily whispering to dolls that had no faces. He pressed his forehead to the wood and felt the house breathing with them, patient, ancient, hungry. For the first time since Korea he understood he was not the hunter here, he was only the latest dog on a chain that went straight down through the clay into something older than scripture. Some mornings he woke with dirt under his fingernails and no memory of leaving the bed. Once he found a fresh mound of fresh-turned earth beside his mother's grave, small as a child's, already sprouting kudzu. He stood over it until dusk, shotgun hanging loose in his hands, waiting for whatever was growing there to break through. Nothing ever did, but the vines tightened around the fence posts like green fingers, and the house leaned a fraction closer to the ground, and Harlan's shadow, even at noon, began to stretch too far ahead of him, as though something else was learning to wear his shape. The spring of 1999 arrived green and venomous, the kudzu swelling overnight until it looked like the woods themselves were trying to swallow the house whole. Lily Gentry turned 16 on a morning when the mockingbirds screamed like alarms and the air tasted of rust. She had grown into the same long-limbed, pale-haired beauty that had once been Cora's and Dolores's, but the resemblance stopped at the eyes. Lily's were colder, older, the color of creek ice just before it gives way under your weight. Harlan was 65 now, joints creaking like the porch boards, but the hunger in him had only sharpened with age. He watched her the way a butcher watches a calf he has already named for supper, patient, proprietary, certain. Lily had learned early to keep her back to walls and her hands busy, idle fingers invited his. Still, the house was small and the nights were long, and the lock on her bedroom door had disappeared the winter she was 12. He took her on the first warm night, fireflies blinking like slow green sparks beyond the open window. She didn't fight, fighting only made him smile wider. Instead she stared at the ceiling while he moved above her, counting the water stains that looked like continents, memorizing every crack in the plaster the way prisoners memorize bars. When he finished he kissed her forehead and told her she was his best girl yet, voice tender as a lullaby. She tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue clean through and said nothing. Summer thickened. Her dresses stopped fitting. First the waist, then the breasts, then everything. Cora noticed first, eyes flicking to the gentle new curve under Lily's apron, face going still the way a pond goes still when something rotten surfaces. Dolores saw next and dropped an entire jar of fig preserves. The glass shattered across the kitchen floor like ice breaking and neither woman moved to clean it. Harlan only smiled, carved another shallow notch in the bedpost that already looked like a tally of sins. By August the swell was undeniable. Lily moved through chores with the same mechanical grace she'd always had, feeding chickens, hanging wash, scrubbing stains that would never lift. At night she stood on the back porch barefoot, one hand spread across the taut drum of her belly, feeling the stranger inside her shift and kick like it already knew the rules. Sometimes she pressed so hard her nails left crescents, as though she could push the thing back into whatever dark it had come from. Harlan began speaking to the unborn child through her skin, palm flat and possessive, promising it the same land, the same blood, the same unbreakable circle. He said the words like benedictions. Lily listened with her face turned toward the pines and felt the kudzu creep another inch up the porch posts, vines thick as pythons, leaves whispering secrets in a language only the house still spoke fluently. October 2001 brought a new preacher to Clay County, a young man named Elias Crane with wire-rimmed glasses and a Carolina accent soft enough to make widows cry. He drove a dented white Corolla with a fish sticker on the back and a trunk full of pamphlets that promised deliverance in 12-point font. On his third Sunday he preached on Lot and the cities of the plain, voice cracking when he spoke of fathers who failed to protect their daughters. Half the congregation shifted in the pews, the other half stared at the Gentry pew, empty as always. Monday morning he turned down the red dirt road nobody local used anymore. The gate hung open, chain long since rusted through. He parked beside Harlan's rusted Ford, walked up the path with a casserole in one hand and a Bible in the other, rehearsing the gentle words he used on alcoholics and wife-beaters. The porch boards bowed under his weight like they resented the intrusion. No one answered his knock, but the door stood ajar, exhaling a breath that smelled of sour milk and something coppery underneath. Inside, the house felt underwater. Dust floated in the slanted light like pale fish. Crane called out once, twice, voice thinning. From the kitchen came the slow scrape of a chair. Harlan rose from the table, 6 to 7 years carved deep into his face, unbuttoned shirt showing the white pelt of chest hair and the new tremor in his left hand. Behind him Cora and Delores stood at the sink, backs turned, hands moving through dishwater that had gone cold hours ago. Lily sat in the rocker that had once been her great-grandmother's, belly huge now under a faded dress, eyes fixed on Crane with the flat curiosity of something caged too long. The preacher found his tongue eventually, spoke of community, of healing, of Christ's love for the broken. Harlan listened the way a cat listens to a bird it has already decided to kill, head cocked, good eye glittering. When Crane asked why none of the women ever came to services, why the children, he had heard there were children, were never seen in town, Harlan smiled with the half of his mouth that still worked and said the Gentrys had their own way of keeping the Sabbath. Crane left the casserole on the table, promised to return, backed out the door still talking. In the yard he noticed the kudzu had grown clear across the front path since he arrived 20 minutes earlier, tendrils thick as his wrist looping around his ankles. He kicked free and almost ran to his car. That night every dog within 5 miles howled until dawn. The next Sunday the preacher's sermon was on Cain, on blood that cries from the ground. Attendance dropped by half. 2 weeks later Crane's Corolla was found nose down in the Talladega Creek, driver's door open, casserole dish still in the passenger seat, pamphlets swollen with water and floating like dead white moths. The sheriff ruled accidental drowning. Nobody asked why a man afraid of deep water had driven off a bridge with no guardrail on a clear night. After that the county learned to look away again, harder this time. But something had shifted. The kudzu grew faster, swallowing fence posts whole. The house settled another inch into the clay, windows staring out like eyes that had seen too much and liked it. And Lily, rocking slower now, began to hum the same cracked lullaby her great-grandmother once hummed, the one that had no words, only a tune that sounded like a chain being dragged across stone. December 2025 arrives on a wind that smells of iron and pine pitch. Harlan Ray Gentry is 89, shrunk inside his overalls like a wasp in an old cocoon, but the hunger never aged, it only grew quieter, more patient. He sits on the porch all day in a ladderback chair, quilt over his knees, watching the yard with the one eye that still works. The kudzu has won. It swallowed the fence years ago, climbed the tin roof, hangs in heavy curtains over the windows so the house looks drowned in green. Only the front door stays clear, as though something inside still insists on being able to see who comes up the path. Lily's daughter, Ruth, is 24 now. Same pale hair, same ice-water eyes, same mouth that learned early how silence can be a weapon. She has never left the property except once, at 14, when she walked to the highway and stood there until Harlan's truck pulled alongside and the door opened without a word. She got in. No one in town even remembers what she looks like. The Gentry women stopped being seen the county's business a long time ago. Ruth moves through the house like a shadow that has decided to burn. She cooks the same 3 meals on rotation, washes the same sheets that never quite lose their stains, tends Harlan the way you tend a loaded gun you're waiting for the right moment to turn around. At night she stands on the porch after he's asleep, staring at the rusted 55-gallon drum behind the barn where they burn trash and worse. She has been carrying the red plastic gasoline can back and forth for weeks, filling it a little at a time from the pump that still works when you prime it right. Tonight the moon is a thin, wicked blade. Frost glitters on the kudzu like broken glass. Harlan's voice drifts out through the screen door, cracked and wet but still commanding. "Ruthie, supper's waiting. Come on in here, girl." The words are soft, almost loving, the same tone he used on her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, every link in the chain he forged link by link with his own body. Ruth stands at the foot of the steps, gasoline can heavy in her right hand, a kitchen match pinched between her left thumb and forefinger. The house breathes behind Harlan, boards swollen with decades of damp and secrets, exhaling the faint sweetrot smell of kudzu and old blood. Somewhere inside Cora and Delores sit at the kitchen table exactly where they sat 20 years ago, 40 years ago, hands folded, waiting for whatever happens next the way they have always waited. Ruth looks at the dark windows, at the vines that pulse like veins, at the old man who believes to his marrow that the world ends at the edge of his yard and begins again between a woman's legs. She strikes the match against the porch rail. The flare lights her face for one heartbeat, calm, almost smiling almost, and the night rushes in to meet it.